I did 13 years of university, and yes, I started with a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and Philosophy. That was a 3-year degree, and then I did a Bachelor of Laws, and that I did at York University in Toronto. And then I did a Master of Laws in University of Essex, so it was another year. And then I did the PhD in Geneva, the Graduate Institute of International Studies. So altogether that was 13 years of university. And probably, it was because I was very interested in the topic. And so I kept on, getting into different areas of human rights and international law, so that's why I studied maybe too much. But it's an area that I really love and I'm passionate about. So it's a good question. I think that student life is probably one of the most precious phases in life ever, because that is a time when you meet people from various backgrounds, different ethnicities, different languages, different countries, and you may be confronted with ideas you don't accept. And that, then you're forced to examine your own ideas. So, to be as active as possible in student life, I think, is a real benefit for people. It's very important to be involved in the social life and in politics and in all the different, some of the different clubs and things, so that the interaction is maximized during this very important phase. That's the time when you're developing your ideas much more seriously than you can when you're younger. So student life is something I miss. And maybe I've never left it because I'm always connected with the university in some way. So academia is a very valuable thing for society and for individuals, so for sure. Well, yeah, I mean, it's a long story and I won't go into depth. And I've been interviewed actually by the United Nations International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, the ICTR, about my experience there. So I would invite people to look at that interview for more depth. But what I can just say a few words maybe about it. It was the start of my United Nations career, and I was very fortunate in that it was a chance for me to practice the ideas I had developed in my doctorate thesis, which is about individual responsibility in international law for serious human rights violations, really, which is the essence of international criminal law. And when I published my my thesis in 1992, the field was the field of international criminal law was virtually non-existent. It was very hardly existing, because there had been very little done since Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals in 1945 and 1946. So then the next year, when the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia was established, that field started to develop very rapidly, and that is why the High Commissioner for Human Rights called on me for whatever expertise that I could bring to investigate, to help investigations on the Commission of Experts in Rwanda for the Security Council. And so in the course of those investigations, I was brought to Rwanda several times and to undertake investigations into the massacres, which was, of course, a very shocking experience. But that began my career in the United Nations, and I stayed with the UN for 7 years in Geneva, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And then I went back to academia and started teaching at the University of Hong Kong for 4 years, and then moved to Sweden at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law, and then to Italy, and then from Italy to The Hague. And so hopping around a little bit, but even during the academic phase of my life, I've also been doing work in various capacities with the United Nations as well. Most of the time as a consultant, or for some time I was coordinator of the UN Human Rights Council's group of experts on Darfur, and part of Sudan. That was back in 2007. So in a way my career has been very much a dual track of academia and putting that into practice through the United Nations and various institutes. So it's been very fulfilling for me. I've enjoyed, because if you're just doing the practical work, it doesn't give you enough time to step back and to reflect upon what are the principles and what are the lessons learned from practice. And if you're too much in the academic sphere, you get some distance from the practice, and you start to think more in the abstract, which can sometimes have less relevance to the world. So as Karl Marx said, the point is not just to describe the world, but to change it. So you can bring about change in whatever small way that's possible, I think most effectively by trying to develop your ideas as much as possible in light of the latest practical experience and the world conditions that are going on. So in human rights I've been kind of going back between practice and academia, and I hope that some way that may be valuable, and that's something I found interesting. Every country has really something fascinating about it, and most of all, I think fascinating in all countries is the people. When you talk to people, their experiences in some way are universal, because we're all human beings. We all have the same basic problems and challenges and the same human rights, but at the same time our history, culture, language and life experience is very different in so many ways. So whenever I go to a country, I'm always fascinated by those kind of differences, the things that make us, that bring us together in a very universal way, but also those differences. So I've been very happy to go to a place like Mongolia, for example, which is very different in terms of the people and the history and the culture. It was a great empire of Genghis Khan, and stretched all the way to Europe and into China and everywhere. And you have the very fascinating landscape and traditions. Or a place like Morocco, which has great cuisine and history and topography. And I love being in Italy. Italy is great. We have a base there. And so many countries. So I'm from Canada. Canada's great. Russia I've always found fascinating. You said except Russia, but I have to say something about Russia, because since I was growing up in Canada, where I was born and raised, I always found Russia very fascinating. And I understand very little Russian and cannot speak really Russian, but I wish I could speak it better and learn the language, because language is the key to the culture. And Russia has a very deep culture and history, as we know, but it's not possible to learn the cultures and languages of every country. But Russia has always been fascinating for me, and it's one of the reasons that I've been coming to Russia every year, and this is my 5th time in Russia. So it's hard to generalize about European students in general, because there's so many different countries, but maybe I could say that I could broaden that question out a little bit and say that to include North American students as well as different areas, and Asian students and everywhere. So I'll give you a more globalist view. I found probably that in Europe, and I would include Russia and also China, they take history very seriously. I mean, continental Europe. So when I've taught in Beijing, for example, at the Peking University Law School, or I gave some lectures in Belarus or in different places. I find that if I'm talking about at least this century or the last century, and the Second World War and the First World War, etc., people know it very well, and I don't have to work as hard. So people know that history very well. Whereas in Canada and United States, they're a little bit less detailed in their knowledge often. It's hard to generalize, but I found some very clear tendencies there. On the other hand, in the United States, Canada, and I would say United Kingdom, the Anglo-Saxon traditions, the students tend to be much more critical and willing to speak out and to criticize a professor, which I think is very important. I encourage that very much, Socratic interaction, because when you start to operationalize the ideas yourself through argument, as Socrates did so many years ago in ancient Athens, you sharpen up your own ideas more. So while students in Europe and Asia may have the content more strongly of history, for example, and politics, they can be weaker at questioning and a little bit less critical, or at least less openly critical. And I would like to see less deference to authority. There should be more. So that's maybe some general tendency that I have noticed. But with a little encouragement. I remember when I was teaching for a full month I mentioned the Peking University Law School. And I was teaching the advanced course in international human rights law. And at the very beginning, first couple of days, students who were very hesitant to speak, and they just, they wanted the answers. But I think knowledge and learning has to be more about not the answers so much, whatever those are, but it's about thinking and trying to find the right questions. And that sounds maybe very banal or cliche, but I think it is correct to say that if we can identify the most pertinent questions, then we are on the way to the struggle towards a closer approximation to knowledge. I think it's very anti-knowledge. It's not very wise to say, well, this is the answer, because these accepted truths become knocked down all the time. And I certainly don't like to impose my opinions or my version of knowledge on the students. They have to know content well. They have to know what happened in the United Nations and the conventions, the norms. So I put a lot of content in my lectures, as you've seen. But it's also important around the issues, around the critical issues, to be able to realize where are the ambiguities, and where is the law uncertain, and where are things to be debated. And ultimately, and this was the beauty of Socrates, is he could debate just about anything and say, look, if you look deeply, there's always a question or an issue. So I think critical thinking is very, very critical. Critical is essential to a real search for knowledge. Critical thinking, self-criticism, and it's not easy. Practitioners and academics in the human rights movement, we have to be very careful, because human rights has become very successful, and it's very popular. It's always in the news. It's a very successful movement since 1945, and that makes people very, I would say, a bit arrogant to say, oh, this is human rights, and we have the answers, and you have to do things like this and like that. So as a human rights practitioner and as an academic, one has to guard against dogma, dogmatic thinking and ideology. And some people would say, well, human rights is an ideology. And perhaps in some ways it is. But I would also say that when it comes down to the basic, physical protection of people from harm, it doesn't seem very ideological to me. And protecting human dignity and making sure that people are not injured or harmed is for me not an ideological matter, or not very much, maybe in some small way. Or if it is an ideology, it's an ideology that I like. But you know, so those are just some ideas, I mean, that I would venture out there in response to your question. Yeah, or maybe they don't even think that they're right, but that they think that in order to pass the course, that you have to give the teachers, you know, what they expect. And even some law faculty members, I've been interacting with Russian law faculty and political science, international relations faculty in Russia and also Ukraine and in Belarus and Azerbaijan and many other places. And it's an issue everywhere, and also in China. And when I teach and give lectures and things, I try to open up discussion as much as possible, and also not to, I mean, try to convey the impression very strongly that you're not going to be safe just following my views or what you think is my opinion. And I may even sometimes hide my opinion until, you know, later we get a good discussion and we see what are the different arguments at play. Because ultimately I may be wrong. I'm often wrong about things, and nobody has a monopoly on truth. I may have studied the area more than many people, or more than the students, but even, you know, students often know more than the professor of some areas, because they're living in a place, or they have studied or done an essay on a particular topic. So often in a group of students, collectively the students may know much more than the professor on particular issues. And I think it's important for professors to recognize that as well. So that's one of the things, you know, I'm involved sometimes advising different law faculties and other faculties that are teaching human rights about their curriculum. Not only on the content of the curriculum, but about pedagogy. And I was doing that extensively in Turkey, and also in Kenya, and in Zimbabwe, and in China, and then also in Geneva, and different places, many places. And that's one of my recommendations, is always to increase the interactivity as much as possible. Not only that, but it shouldn't just be lecture style and questions afterwards and things, or during the lectures, but there should be teamwork and team exercises and moot courts and these kind of things. That's why we did a case study afterwards yesterday. But it's also because in the real world, in human rights, in the human rights sphere, or in international law, or in any public service area these days, you don't work on your own. You work in an office, you work in a non-governmental organization, you work with an international organization, but you work in teams, you work in groups. So your ability to coordinate with people, to get along with people, and to be able to share ideas is also part of learning, emotional intelligence. And because ultimately we want a good result in whatever work we are doing, whether it's in human rights or law or whatever field, and we have to work in teams. So collegiality is very important, and so I think those kind of group exercises and simulations and interactive pedagogy is very important. You know, that's always a challenge, and you always have that. There's always some people who are more shy. So what I try to do is support that person by, they have to break through their shell. So I tell them I'm going to, you know, I put them on the spot sometimes and ask them, what do you think about this? And sometimes they're so shy they can't even say a word. I say, don't worry, I'm going to come back to you later. And then I call on some other people. They say that they see that their colleagues are able to speak, or maybe in smaller groups they'll come out, but over one or two lectures they really have to speak. And I found inevitably that students who, some of the most shy students become the most outspoken and more confident afterwards. I've never had a student tell me that they resented it, or they didn't like that, you know, I encouraged them to be more forthcoming. In fact, I've had many students tell me that, you know, thank you very much because I was too shy. It's similarly, students tend to come up after class and say, I want to ask you this question or that question. I say, these are great questions, but too bad you didn't ask during the class, because then we could have a better discussion. So I try to fold after class questions, or during the breaks, also back into the class. So ask people, okay, repeat your question that you asked me afterwards. And I challenge students, but I always very careful not to insult anyone or make them feel like their questions are stupid or something, because I don't think that, you know, in my last 25 years of experience in academia, I don't think I've ever had a really stupid question. And if I have had, it must have been because I failed to teach properly. So I would take it as my own failure, not theirs. A student is there to learn, and I've found everybody very respectful and hardworking. It's rare that you find students are not there for the, you know, they're there for the wrong purposes, or that they don't have goodwill. So because of this enthusiasm that I've always found, and maybe I've just been lucky, but I think it's really a credit to the student body that they're always very dedicated in this field of human rights and humanitarian law, international criminal law. It makes it a joy to teach students. And so for me, it's very important to have this interaction and full participation. And it's always a challenge for female students, because many times in some cultures, female students are not encouraged to speak, and sometimes you have the males, they're the minority. I've had some classes where it's been almost entirely female. Like in Belarus, there was a class like that, in a couple of classes, and so, you know, I had to encourage equal participation everywhere. And also you find some disabled students and some students who are from different ethnic or religious backgrounds who maybe feel less confident to voice their opinions, and they just need usually support and you know, some encouragement. And so that always works, I find. So I hadn't really thought about it, but you know, it's always an idea. It's an attractive idea, and Russia is a great country, and so many things going on, and it's very encouraging for me to see the consortium that I've been very happy to be associated with, this consortium of 9 faculties, and to see human rights being disseminated and being spread through the country. And as you may know, I've designed a course on monitoring, investigation and reporting of serious violations of human rights, humanitarian law and international criminal law under the auspices of the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the consortium of Russian faculties. And so if that leads me to have a stronger engagement in Russia, of course, that would be something I would, you know, consider. I think it would be very interesting to do that.